This week's lecture focused on the characteristics of effective learning environments, and I particularly framed the establishment and fostering of effective learning environments as a matter of talk. I'll get on to that in a couple more slides. Let's have a look at the characteristics of effective learning environments to begin this workshop. Literature would tell us that there are 4 or 5 different characteristics of effective learning environments. They're environments where people feel safe, both physically and emotionally, where they are supported, where everybody has a sense of belonging and being valued, so they're inclusive, and where students are challenged to learn with relevant and interesting activities when they're engaged in their learning. Let's take these one by one briefly, but you may need to do more reading. The Churchill reading that you were asked to do this week provides a little bit more meat on these bones, but there's even more reading that you can do on these areas. Let's start with safety. There are a lot of programs that schools have in place, as well as policies that are aimed at supporting the physical safety of the students within them. Examples of these might include a sun safety program, a stranger danger program. Both of these are quite common in primary settings. Bullying, including cyberbullying, policies and programs are in place in the majority of schools, regardless of the setting. There are also policies around things like food allergies, in particular anaphylaxis due to food allergies. There may well be policies around parental access, making sure that those parents who have AVOs are not given access to their children. The physical environment of a school needs to be safe as well. The furniture, the lockers, the carpets and the cabling, all those sorts of normal occupational health and safety issues need to be attended to. But safety also refers to emotional safety. Do your students feel safe enough in your classroom to reveal something of themselves? Do they feel comfortable in the classroom to share their ill-formed ideas without fear of humiliation and embarrassment, of being ridiculed by their peers or even by their teacher? What might you do as a teacher to generate such a sense of emotional safety? How do you foster that sense of belonging in the classroom so that the children don't fear taking a risk with what they say about their learning? It's a really critical point for you to remember. It's a nice segue to our second but closely related characteristic, that of being a supportive environment. Again, at school level, policies can be explicitly and overtly aimed to support students with specific needs. For example, programs to support students who identify as GLBTI, or programs to support students from economically disadvantaged families. For example, increasing numbers of schools now run a breakfast program to ensure that their students are fed a healthy breakfast, because we all know that a healthy breakfast, our brains will work more efficiently and effectively. There might also be programs that support gifted students. Student welfare officers can help with programs to prevent and minimise bullying that we talked about earlier. But support also needs to be provided at the classroom level. Your role as a teacher is to support your students individually and collectively to achieve their learning objectives. But you can only provide the support that is needed if you know what your students need on an individual basis. So it's really important that you get to know your students in order to support them. Inclusive classrooms acknowledge that diversity exists in our classrooms, and inclusive classrooms act in ways that make each student feel accepted and their differences accommodated, regardless of their gender, their physical, intellectual, social, emotional, linguistic, cultural, religious, or other characteristics. To do this, to be inclusive, once again, it is crucial to know your students and their backgrounds and their needs. But it also requires you to think creatively about what you might need to do in the classroom to accommodate every student's needs. It also requires you to avoid bias of any kind, even if it is unintentional. To avoid that bias, you need to know your core beliefs. And the activities that I asked you to do in preparation for workshop 2 were again geared towards you unpacking those core beliefs, those taken for granted values that you hold because they come out in how you teach. We might talk about inclusion a little bit more next week. The final one, sometimes it's seen as two different characteristics of effective learning environments, is that they are engaging places to be. In our workshop, we talked about what engagement really means, and it's important to distinguish between engagement and being busy, and being compliant and appearing as though you're doing your work. Learners who are engaged are involved and committed in their learning. They are intrinsically motivated rather than extrinsically motivated by the reward of a sticker or a game as an early finishing activity. So engaging doesn't necessarily equal fun, although they may well be fun activities. Activities are engaging when they result in the students paying attention to what they're learning, when they're demonstrating curiosity in interest in what they are learning, being involved in what they're learning. Research also suggests that this happens when students are challenged, but challenged only to the extent that they believe the task is potentially achievable, not beyond their capability. So I've given you a little link there to an education department website that looks at the characteristics of effective schools. And you can see in some of those cogs on that wheel, I think is what the graphic might be, that some of these characteristics are reflected in the department's advice about what an effective school is. Look at the bottom, high expectations of all learners. It's the challenge activity. Stimulating and secure learning environments. Again, the challenge and the engagement is implicit in that. And secure, safe and supportive. Learning communities. Learning communities are supportive places to be. A shared vision and goals, being inclusive. So, let's move on to the next. In this and the next two slides, I try and draw links between these sorts of characteristics that I've been talking about and where they might appear in the standards for graduate teachers. And I urge you to go to the AITSL website and download or make yourself familiar with the standards that you are expected to demonstrate as a teacher on your graduation at the end of 2016. And you can see that these things don't just come out of thin air or out of my mouth. They're in fact grounded in theory and in practice. So on this particular page, we're looking at inclusive. So standard 1.3, know the students and how they learn. But you also have to demonstrate knowledge of strategies that are responsive to the learning strengths and needs of students from diverse linguistic, cultural, religious and socioeconomic backgrounds. So here comes that inclusiveness. Strategies for teaching Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, differentiating teaching to meet the specific learning needs of students across the full range of abilities, full participation of students with disability. These are all about being inclusive in what you do as a teacher in the classroom. In standard 3, when you're planning for and implementing effective teaching and learning, the very first substandard sounds terrible. The very first subsection of this standard is to establish challenging learning goals. So here's the challenge and engagement. So including a range of teaching strategies might be a way to engage your students. And standard 4 is all about creating and maintaining supportive and safe learning environments, supporting inclusive student participation, being safe and responsible and ethical about how you and your students use technology, maintain students' well-being and safety, demonstrate practical approaches to managing challenging behaviour. So all of these characteristics are reflected in the teaching standards that you need to be able to demonstrate at the end of next year. Back to the title of today's workshop, it's all in the talk. I like to frame the establishment of teaching effective learning environments as being about how you talk. Teachers talk a lot. We talk with our mouths, but we also talk in other ways, and our talk reveals what we believe. How we talk, what we talk about, how much we talk tells us something and tells our students something about what we believe about their learning. How we speak, the tone that we use, the questions we ask, the feedback that we give, the comments that we made, all have an effect on our students, which can be incredibly positive or not. How you act also speaks volumes about what you believe. Our actions speak louder than our words. The gestures, the facial expressions, how you group the students, for example, all reflect core beliefs about learning and teaching, about your education values. The activities that you plan, the assessments that you set, how you might differentiate activities or not between groups of students with different needs, the challenge that's embedded in your activities, the relevance of your activities to the lives of the students. Are the students active in doing something or sitting passively receiving information from you or copying from the board? Is technology an integral part of your lesson plans? Can you see how your lesson plans can be a reflection of what you believe about learning and teaching? In your methods and your discipline courses, you'll explore a lot more about planning. But as you do, and when you're in schools, try to identify how your own plans are talking to your students about what you believe about learning and about teaching. Try to observe what your mentor teacher believes about learning and teaching through the activities that they design in their curriculum. Do they issue a whole stack of worksheets that they expect the students to complete? Or do they set an inquiry topic that they expect the students to explore and discover ideas and concepts and skills for themselves? What does this say about what they believe about learning and teaching? The way you organise your teaching spaces also reflects your beliefs and speaks to the students about what you value as a teacher. Are your desks all in rows? Do you have collaborative learning spaces? What sort of resources do you have in the classroom? Do you display student work as a celebration of their achievement, or is that hidden away? All of these actions of ours speak to our students in some ways, so these are practices we need to pay attention to. Our talk matters, and we talk in multiple ways. Let's take a slightly more detailed look at only two of these aspects of teacher talk: asking questions and giving feedback. Classrooms are filled with questions. There are questions teachers ask students, the questions students ask teachers, the questions students ask other students, and there's questions that teachers and students ask of themselves. So if questions are at the very core of teaching, how do you ask an effective question? Questions are very powerful tools as they can be used for multiple purposes. They can be used to challenge students' thinking, to focus discussion, to identify misunderstandings, or to humiliate. Not that that's a desirable objective for your questions. Questioning is really an art form and can take years to develop. I want to introduce you to some question types and urge you to develop your skills around effective questioning. The skills of questioning and issues around questions will be something that you'll revisit in different courses over the years of your program. Why do teachers ask questions? Why do students ask questions? How do teachers frame and ask effective questions? When should you ask a question as a teacher? Who asks and who answers questions in the classroom, and who doesn't? What are some different ways of asking questions, and what type of questions do teachers ask? On this particular slide, we talked about some different ways of categorising questions. And the first dot point really talks about three different types of questions. There's those relationship questions that you ask as a teacher as a way of establishing rapport with the students. How are you? How can I help you? Then there's learning questions. The majority of the questions that you will ask as a teacher in the classroom are linked to student learning. Questions to check for understanding might, for example, how does that work? Why do you think it works that way? Questions to encourage divergent thinking. What might happen if? Questions to help students make connections to prior learning or related concepts. Do you remember when we looked at this? Learning questions might also relate to the task, to the management of the task. What stage are you up to? What might you do next? Questions that help students to self-regulate their learning. Then there are behaviour-based questions. questions to influence student behaviour. For example, is that how we act when we work in a group? We also talked in class about the difference between open-ended and closed questions. Closed questions are often seen as something that's inherently less desirable than an open-ended question which asks a student to think for themselves. But there are still times in some classrooms, in some contexts, where closed questions are appropriate. But if the majority of the questions in your classroom are closed questions, what does that say about what you believe about learning and teaching? In what way does that silence the students' questions? Another way of distinguishing between different types of questions is to divide them into product, process and opinion questions. The product questions relate to what, where and when, and in many cases are relatively closed questions. Process questions might relate to how does something work. And opinion questions, my favourite questions, are about why something works or why you think the way you think or why that was different to that, this was different to that. Okay. Then we got on to Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom's taxonomy, and I prefer to use Bloom's revised taxonomy for those people who are going to run off and explore Bloom. Hundreds of websites around Bloom's taxonomy, just do a search and you'll come up with everything that's relevant, is a way of providing a taxonomy for different thinking, from lower order to higher order thinking. And some very clever people with lots of time have come up with different ways, have used Bloom's taxonomy as a way to classify questions. So from lower order to higher order questions. And the next slide we'll have a look at that. Normally Bloom's taxonomy is represented as a ladder or a triangle. But this graphic, this infographic, probably wouldn't fit neatly into a traditional Bloom's format. But it is a hierarchical way of thinking and of asking questions, starting with remember as the lowest of the orders and create as the highest order. So remember, understand, apply, analyse, evaluate and create is the general order of Bloom's taxonomy. And this graphic provides you with some example questions under each of the levels of Bloom's revised taxonomy. Really useful for prompting you about the sorts of questions you might ask in a classroom, or the sorts of questions your students might be encouraged to ask. In your first assessment task, you're being asked to design an observation audit. I wanted to give you some examples today to get you to start thinking about what you might observe in the classroom and how you might go about designing an instrument to help you focus on that particular observation. So this is an example of a question audit, and it's answering the question, who asks and who answers in a classroom? The idea behind this is that you draw a seating plan of your classroom and over a single lesson record which student answers a question and which students ask a question. What we ask you to do then is to analyse the results. So have a look. Let's have a look at an example. Hopefully this will work. Okay, so in class I asked everybody to analyse what was happening in this particular instrument. This is a picture of a classroom and the results of a particular audit that was carried out. So what do you think was happening? Pause here and just spend a minute telling yourself what you see from this. What's it telling you? In class, one student observed that Nathan seemed to answer the majority of the questions. Somebody else observed that the teacher seemed to dominate the question asking by far the majority of the questions. Another student observed that the class was not particularly engaged. At that point, I asked the group to be careful in their distinction between evidence and inference. Yes, there is evidence from this piece of paper that Nathan answered the most questions. And yes, there is clear evidence that the teacher asked by far the majority of the questions. But there's not really clear evidence that the class was not engaged. They may well have been very engaged. We don't really know from this. You need to be in that context to be able to draw that inference, to draw that conclusion. So be careful when you're analysing what your observation tool is telling you. You have the privilege or the bonus of being in that context, so the context will influence what you say. But if I was submitting this in the second part of your first assessment, you actually have to trial your observation audit and analyse the outcome and evaluate how effective the instrument was in focusing on your particular aspect of a classroom. If I was to submit this back, I would probably have to write some additional notes explaining what the context was. It may well be that because of the very low level of asking and answering questions amongst the students that they weren't engaged. But it may well have been that they were highly engaged and interested in the answers that Nathan, Sam and Darius gave to the questions. It could have been that the students were answering their own questions. It could also have been that the teacher's questions could have been rapid fire. Boom, 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 boom. They could have been elaborations on the same question. So it's hard to know without explaining the context whether your analysis is a reasonable inference based on good information or whether you're making assumptions that aren't necessarily justifiable. So take care of that one. Let's move on to feedback. Feedback, whether it's summative, that is, whether it comes at the end of a piece of work, or whether it's formative, that is, assessment that is given as an ongoing mechanism, feedback can be a powerful tool for learning, but it can also be a powerful weapon for impeding learning. Feedback is often thought of as just the written comments that might be recorded on students' work. However, it is much broader than this. In class, we talked about times where feedback was not so positive and when it was positive. What was talked about was the marks that teachers make on students' work. The ticks, the circles, the question marks and exclamation marks. And I shared an example from my own study when I was doing a master's level course, and I received a 79 out of 100. Now, as you're probably all aware, an 80 is that magic figure when you crack the H1 or the high distinction. And I was desperate. I'd been getting these high-level distinctions, but I really wanted an H1. So I looked for the feedback. How was I going to improve my performance to get that desired H1? All the feedback consisted of was a mark, a series of ticks at various points through my essay, and the comment was, "Very good work." It gave me no clue what I needed to do to improve. It was totally ineffective feedback. The remarks that we make: "Good boy," "Good girl," "Good job." What is that telling you? What was good about the job that I just did? "Good girl"? How patronising is that? So the remarks that we use. What a powerful word you used just then. In our class, I was giving feedback to the students verbally. I was saying things like, "I really like the connections that you're making between this week and last week." I was being quite specific. And specific feedback is really important. What specifically was good about it? What wasn't so good about it? The gestures that we make as teachers, I talked about this before. The shaking the finger, the thumbs up, the folding the arms, the frowns, the facial expressions that we make. They're also ways of giving feedback, both positive and negative feedback. Things that as a teacher you need to pay attention to. Indeed, each time teachers place your hand on a student's shoulder to offer encouragement, you're providing feedback. And the feedback that you provide can shape young people's views of themselves as learners and as people. So take care with the feedback that you give. Here's another example of an observational audit instrument that was designed. And in the design of this, this particular audit, a lot of reading was done to work out what the characteristics of effective feedback were, or the characteristics of not so effective feedback. So one of the things that we were looking at is who's giving the feedback, is it the teachers or the students? Is this feedback verbal or non-verbal or written? How often are teachers giving this sort of feedback? Is the feedback directed to an individual or to a small group or to the whole class? How frustrating is it when one person in the class mucks up and the teacher gives a rant to the whole class? How pointless is that? So is the feedback being directed to the appropriate audience for that feedback? What's the feedback focused on? Is the feedback specific? That's a really important thing. Feedback must be specific. But is this being specific to the individual? Is it about a particular learning habit they have? Is it about the task itself? Or is it about something else? Is the nature about behaviour? Is it about content? Is it about skills? Is the feedback critical and constructive? Is it positive and rewarding? Or is it destructive? What form does the feedback actually take? Is the feedback extrinsic? Primary schools are particularly guilty of extrinsic motivation. The stickers, the stamps, the chocolates that teachers used to give as rewards, all sorts of different ways to earn the teacher's praise. Or is the feedback aimed at intrinsic motivation? Is the feedback about the learning habits that student is improving upon? One more thing about feedback, and that's about praise. Don't overdo it. Too much praise will set unrealistic expectations on your students, and too much praise tends to overstate achievement. Be judicious with your praise. Saying good job every time a student hands something into you is not effective feedback. Another little point I think I started to allude to earlier, this audit tool is based on what the literature says about the qualities of effective feedback. And this is important for you to consider when you're starting your work on assessment task 1. You need to provide a rationale for why you have chosen the way you have designed your particular observation tool. And you need to be able to draw on relevant educational literature to support the features of your design. So my suggestion would be to start thinking now about what particular area of observation you want to focus on. And we're very specific. We want you to be very specific. It's really easy to walk into a classroom and say, I'm just going to observe what happens. There is so much happening in a classroom, it is difficult to see everything at once. So we're urging you to focus on a quite specific characteristic or feature of a classroom. In the description for your assessment task 2, there are a series of dot points. Have a look at those as thought starters for what aspect of the classroom or of the school you might decide to focus on for your observation instrument or audit tool. Then start reading about it. So if you were to choose questioning, for example, or feedback, for example, go and read about feedback, go and read about questioning, and then design your observation tool based on an aspect of that particular topic. At the beginning of this workshop, I started to talk about how spaces, this way we organise our spaces and the things we put in our teaching spaces, talk about what we believe about teaching and learning. And I've got 2 contrasting examples of what you might find commonly in a primary school classroom on the walls. Have a look at this one. What do you think this says about the classroom teacher, about what he or she values? Compare the previous class rules poster with this class agreements poster. What are the differences between these? two examples of class rules and agreements. What do the differences say about the different beliefs and values of the two teachers involved? There'll be other posters in the primary classroom particularly that reflect the values of the teacher. Are there behaviour charts on the wall, for example, where you get rewarded for good behaviour or put up on the misbehaviour chart if you've been misbehaving? Or are there question walls, spaces that encourage the students to wonder and display their curiosity? Is there student work on display in the classroom, and what does this say of the teacher? Are they celebrating the work that the children are doing? Is it the celebration of every child's work or just the best bits? Is this something that parents can see? In a primary classroom, yes, because most parents will at some point visit the classroom. But in a secondary school, where students tend to be fairly embarrassed if their parents go within 200 metres of a classroom, how is student work celebrated? Is it shared with parents via an online presence, or is it just that the best examples are put in display cases in the school foyer or the corridors? What are these practices saying about the teacher and the sorts of learning environments they're created? So in what ways is that learning environment made safe emotionally and physically, supportive, engaging, challenging and inclusive?